Welcome back, everybody. I mentioned at the end of last lesson that we were going to talk about how we become the way we are. Obviously, it's going to be a pretty, short look at it, but all the years I've done pastoring and counseling, I've been trying to find shorter and shorter, but comprehensive enough ways to talk about how we become the way we are so that we can just kind of look at ourselves through that filter and then look at other people through that filter. In Genesis 3, we talked about the fall and the result that it had where God spoke to Adam and he was afraid because I was naked, so I hid. It affected his ability to be, to know himself, like himself, and be himself. And the same thing with Eve. So a statement I would feel comfortable making is the most devastating effects of the fall were relational. Our ability to have healthy relationships with God, ourselves, and others were just kind of thrown off track really badly. Now, here's the thought we're going to get into today. Early life experiences are the key to our relationship skills and patterns. Early life experiences, what does that mean? Well, this whole concept of boundaries, you didn't just kind of find them laying around and, I think this is how I'll do boundaries. Boundaries are learned, and they're learned in our first few years. And I'm definitely one of those counselor types who would say that 80 to 90%, and I really do mean that high, 80 to 90% of what we deal with in our adult life goes back to our childhood. The roots of it, the tendencies are in our childhood. And that'll make a little bit more sense as we get into the lesson today. But here's two tricky little truths. One, the most powerful force in our development is the family. The most powerful force in our development into the people that we are today is the family. Now, the reason I say tricky truths is I'm about to just change one word, and that is this. The most challenging force in our development is the family. Often, the most destructive force in our development is the family. In counseling, normally it's some kind of a situation or crisis that brings somebody into counseling. But if you really slow down and process through the crisis, you find, again, the fancy word for it is developmental issues. And what that means is things that have happened at earlier stages of our development that kind of pushed us off leaning in a certain direction that has affected the way we see ourselves and others, the way we act toward others, and can just really affect something as powerful as boundaries. Another way to say it would be this. In childhood, the outside shapes the inside. So in childhood, we just kind of learn the environment we were born into. I like to ask people a weird question. Did you get to pick your parents? Did you get to pick, did you get a preference sheet? I want my dad to be warm and, affectionate and easily approached. Oh, by the way, if he had lots of money, that'd be cool too. I mean, did you get to say, well, I want a mom who's, affectionate and always available and whatever? And, hopefully your answer is no, that you didn't get to pick your family of origin, we call it. So what does that mean? That means that there's a lot about the person that you are today that you did not get to choose. And, I love the word responsibility, as you can probably tell. So here's the deal. You may not be responsible for the way you are, but you are responsible for changing the way you are. And that's kind of what we're going to talk about real quick is how do we become the person? Why do I struggle with this and this person doesn't, and they struggle with this and I don't? And why do we make some of the choices and decisions that we've made? So in childhood, the outside shapes the inside. Then in adulthood, the inside shapes the outside. So childhood, things around us create how we feel, how we see ourselves and others. And then in adulthood, we live out those beliefs, if you will. So I've kind of boiled this down to three things. Any professional counselors or sociologists or people that study this stuff are not going to be happy that I've taken the complexity of humanity and brought it down to three things. But I feel like these three things cover enough ground for us to feel good about. If you can look at yourself and others through the filter of these three things, you're going to have a pretty good understanding of how you became the way you are and how other people became the way they are. And I just think we can love better if we understand how and why we deal with the particular struggles that each of us deals with. So a couple of them are going to sound a little higher graded than school, you might say. You'll see what I mean in 2 seconds. So 3 key factors that play into how we've become the way that we are. Number 1, genetic or multi-generational predisposition. I know that's a weird phrase, but I'm going to explain it. Genetic multi-generational predisposition. Deuteronomy 5:9, the Bible says this, you shall not worship them or serve them, for I, the Lord your God, am a jealous God, visiting the iniquity of the fathers onto the children to the 3rd and 4th generation. Now, really important thought. It says visiting the iniquity of the fathers. Oftentimes people quote this and they say the sins of the fathers. It's not what it says. It says iniquity. Why do I make an issue of that? Because sin is the act itself, A-C-T, act itself. Iniquity means, the word literally means to be bent or twisted. So iniquity means to lean toward a behavior. It doesn't necessarily mean you're going to do the behavior, but you may have a tendency toward that behavior more so than I do. I'm sure you've noticed things like alcoholism run in families. Anger can run in families, depression, different things. And I believe it's part of the way God created us that we pass things along through genetics and through learning and, and nature, nurture, that whole thing. But it's not to be overlooked too quickly. One of the things we do in the counseling world is what you call a genogram. And a genogram is just it's a way to depict a family multi-generationally. And you use squares for men and circles for women. And you build the generations as you go upward. And you talk about, like, I'll never forget one of the first times I used this with a couple in counseling. The husband was an alcoholic. The wife loved him, wanted to stay married, but just couldn't go on like like things were. And so one of the things we did was we did a genogram. And Howard and Janice were their names, and I have permission to tell their story. And then we went up to his family and her family, and as far as we could go, a couple of generations. On his side, he's an alcoholic. What do you think we saw at every level of his multi-generational chain of reality and people? We saw the word alcoholism all up and down his side. And there was a point in the session where he got this really interesting look on his face when we were doing this. And I said, Howard, what's going on, man? And he said, you mean I didn't do that to myself? And what he was feeling for the first time in his life was the absence of shame, because he's always thought he was weak and made poor decisions and whatever, and that's why he was an alcoholic. Now, has he made some choices? Yes. Has he mishandled some areas of his life? Yes. But did he struggle with alcoholism to the same degree or equal with me? No, because I don't have alcoholism in my family. So all I'm saying is, when we are dealing with things as tricky as boundaries and how we relate to one another and whether or not we manipulate each other to get what we need and want from each other, it's good to get a sense of some family history and what were the beginning issues, challenges, and obstacles that I was going to have to overcome, you're going to have to overcome for you to really live as healthy as God wants you to. So 3 things I told you about how we become the way we are. 1 is genetic multi-generational predisposition. Number 2 is early life imprints. Early life imprints. Dude, why are you using these weird words? Part of why I'm using these weird words is I'm trying to think of things that you'll remember, and I found that imprints tends to kind of stick around. Well, here's what an imprint is. An imprint is when you have an experience connected to a strong feeling or emotion, it creates an imprint. Experience, emotion, imprint. Experience, emotion, imprint. We have imprints for everything. We have imprints for affection, love, risk-taking, trust. Where are they built? They're built in our childhood. Dad comes in the door from a day at work, and little Johnny, 2 years old, walks up and he's got his arms up to be picked up. Dad's distracted or tired or whatever, and he kind of brushes Johnny off. Well, one time, not a big deal. But if that happens enough times, it's going to create an experience connected to an emotion that's going to create an imprint, and little Johnny's going to quit raising his hands, excitedly expectant when his father comes home. And we have imprints like that in all the different areas of our heart. Probably one of the best ways to make an impression on you of what an imprint is you say to a person, young person, boy, girl, doesn't matter, your mom's at the stove cooking, and little Johnny or Debbie, whatever, walks up and mom says, now don't touch the top of the stove. Now, when does that command, if you will, really, really, really make sense to that child? Well, when the child puts his or her hand on the stove, you have an experience with a strong feeling, and it makes an imprint. They may not even walk in the room where the stove is for a while, but it creates an imprint. And we have those kinds of imprints for, I've told you a little bit about my father. So I would walk into a room full of strong male authority figures, and I would just sort of tense up. I would feel insecure and inferior and like I didn't belong there. And I craved just someone that would recognize me and pay attention to me and act like I mattered. And it was based on early life imprints in my relationship predominantly with my father. And it carried over into my adult life. The interesting thing about imprints is once they're imprinted, they operate subconsciously and automatically until and unless you learn to challenge them, which we're going to talk about in a lesson down the road here. Third thing, genetic multi-generational predisposition, early life imprints. And if you think about it, both of those are outside of your ability to choose. Since we didn't choose our family of origin, we're not able to choose our genetic multi-generational predisposition. We're not able to choose our early life imprints. But number three, how did we become the way that we are? Number three is our life choices. So you take all that other stuff in 1 and 2, and number three, our life choices. Let's go back to the alcoholic one. I may be a child of an alcoholic who's a child of an alcoholic, and it may go back 3 or 4 generations. That doesn't automatically mean I'm going to be an alcoholic. It may mean that if I kind of steer the course well and stay away from alcohol, now the addiction may show in some other way, quite honestly. But my point is this: my choices breathe life into that predisposition or not. There's a really cool verse in Romans chapter 6 that says this: don't you realize that you're a slave of whatever you choose to obey? Another translation said it this way: you can choose your master. What a cool thought. You're a slave of whatever you choose to obey. I like to say it like this: anything you say yes to strengthens in its hold on you. Anything you say no to weakens in its hold on you. So imagine you have a pattern that you are trying to break. Every time you say no to that pattern, its hold on you weakens. Now, I wish I could tell you, Shazam, and it's gone. And sometimes that is the case. But oftentimes we have to walk out making that decision to say no to that or say yes to the right thing. And it takes time. And it's just harder than it needs to be. So what are we saying in our lesson today? all of us are the way we are. We all deal with our unique challenges when it comes to boundaries. Some of us, it's harder to figure out how to get our needs met. Some of it's kind of easier to figure out how we get our needs met. And the reason is often the three things we've just talked about and the experiences we've had in our early life. Because of the importance of our early life and the experience that are contained there, in our next lesson, we're going to talk about parenting. Now, don't worry about it if you're not a parent. You're still going to get something out of it. But we're going to talk about parenting with boundaries in mind. In other words, how should this kind of play into the way we see ourselves parenting? And I believe it affects even mentoring, discipleship, and things of that sort. And so that's what we're going to talk about in our next lesson. Look forward to it. Hey, isn't it amazing to think about how the family we grew up in has an effect on us really for the rest of our lives? And the Genogram that we used in the lesson, there should be one in your course guide, or you can just kind of take that as a model and take a plain sheet of paper. But wouldn't it be cool for maybe you and your spouse or you and a friend to do your Genogram, like put you on the graph in the family where you fit, and then work your way upward. If you can get up maybe 2 layers, your parents and then your parents' parents, and all you do is kind of just think of words that sort of describe your sense of that person. And if there's glaring things, alcoholism or anger or whatever, obviously put those. But what's cool is you start noticing the pattern of what we talked about, multi-generational and genetic predisposition. But one thing it does is it awakens you to the fact that a lot of the attributes you have, both good and challenging, you didn't choose them. And it's just kind of it brings grace to you when you kind of realize that you're a link in a chain that you want to alter it if you can, but it helps you start with a sense of just being kind to yourself about the things that you wrestle with.